Hello everybody, we're about to start. We're going to be starting in about 3 minutes or so. I just want to make sure that you can all hear me and see me. So if you can let me know in the chat. It's great. It sounds like I'm loud and clear, which is always good. You may have some background noise. I'm sorry about that. Apologies in advance, but somebody is doing some roadworks outside of my flat. So you might hear a little bit of that. Hopefully it won't be too distracting. If while we're waiting, as I said, just a couple of minutes to let people come in, because we have a lot of people who've registered for this. So we have to make sure that we start on time, but that people have a chance to come. So before we start, if you could write in the chat where you're from or where you're based, what kind of teaching you do, your name, of course, and if you have any experience of remote teaching. People have been posting in the chat, so I've got a good idea now, at least of the people who've said so, what their experience is, because it is useful for me while doing this webinar to know how many people actually are teaching at the moment, remote teaching at the moment, and how many people haven't or are about to start. So it would be very useful to hear what your situation is. When you do post in the chat, you have two options. You have an option to post to all panelists. What I would like you to do is to post to all panelists and attendees. And that way everybody else in the chat will see it, not just myself, Andre and Laura. Andre and Laura are here to support the webinar, and Andre will be in particular picking up on the questions that you can put in the Q&A box, which you've got the chat box where you should just post whatever that comes to mind. But if you have any specific questions about the content of the webinar that you would like addressed, then it's best to put them in that Q&A session, and there'll be a time at the end, some hopefully 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes at the end, where I'll be answering the questions, and Andrew will be selecting the most relevant ones from the Q&A box and the chat, but preferably from the Q&A box. Some of you are still just posting in the chat to all panelists. If you would post to all panelists and attendees, that will mean a lot more people will get the benefit of what you have to say, which would be good.
Hello everyone. I just wanted to say hi to everyone, and just to highlight that Graham will be doing most of the talking, and if you do want to ask a question, so type them in the Q&A section. We will not turn on the audio. It's not exactly the most practical thing on the webinar to turn on audio for everyone, so we do apologize. So if you do have questions, I'm closely monitoring this Q&A box. Type them there, and if we think we've got time to answer, we won't probably answer all of them. We'll bring them up at the, in the discussion afterwards. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Andre. And now it's time to begin. We are recording this, so it would be useful if you have anybody who wasn't able to attend, then you can direct them to the recording. The recording will be made available to everybody, along with the slides that I'm presenting today, and a certificate that you can download, a certificate of attendance, early next week. I think around the 4th of May is when we're hoping to have everything up on the British Council America's website, which I'm sure one of my colleagues, either Andre or Laura, can share in the chat at some point during the webinar. Okay, so without further ado, remote teaching, a survival guide for school teachers. As we're all aware, school teachers and schools all over the Americas, and indeed all over the world, are becoming more creative in developing solutions to keep students learning amid the multiple school closures and general disruption caused by the coronavirus. Now, many, if not most, of these solutions rely on technology to deliver some form of remote online learning and teaching. In this webinar, I'll present ideas and advice for school teachers, particularly those who find themselves having to teach remotely, and particularly for those who are new to it, which I know is not the case with everybody present, but I'm sure and I hope that those who do have some experience with remote teaching will be able to learn something at least from this as well. So first of all, about me, I'm the British Council's English for Educational Systems lead in the Americas. And previously, I was British Council Uruguay country director, and I helped to manage the delivery of weekly English lessons to 75,000 plus primary state school students via video conferencing. Let's move on. Now, the British Council has many years of experience in delivering remote teaching and remote classes to students all over the world. For example, in Uruguay, as I mentioned before, the British Council has been working in partnership with Plan Sabal to cater for the lack of trained and qualified English language teachers in the country. Project managing the remote teaching of, as I said, 75,000 school children aged 8 to 11 years old. And actually, Andre, who is moderating this, was one of the first, if not the first, remote teachers on that project.
Yes,
and if you look,
indeed, I was. It was a very interesting experience, yes.
And Andre, if you look carefully, you'll see a picture of yourself remote teaching during this presentation.
Yes, I used to be famous.
Great. If you want to know more about that project, then I'd like to direct you to this book, Remote Language Teaching. It's a book of research papers and case studies that was published by the British Council in 2019, and it's available to download free from the British Council's Teaching English website. You may find it useful, although the remote teaching we do on the Sabal and Ingles project is very different because the children are usually together in a classroom with a local classroom teacher present. But having said that, some of the chapters are still very relevant to any kind of remote teaching, so I do recommend that. Right, what is remote teaching? Before we go any further, I suppose we should define it. So remote teaching is the practice of synchronous teaching, i.e. live online through video conferencing. So what we're doing now is synchronous. What we're doing now is remote. This is usually combined with other asynchronous online teaching and learning. So, for example, using email, using a learning management system like Moodle or Edmodo or Google Classroom to do teaching and to provide tasks and activities for the students to learn when the class is not actually happening. I mean, you might do that anyway, even if you're teaching face-to-face in a school, but particularly at the moment that is interesting. However, the focus of today's webinar is on the live online, the remote teaching of that. Although I will speak a little bit about the support that you can provide students through an LMS. Now, there is also a difference, I think, between the kind of remote teaching that teachers are being asked to do now, which is, I think, best described as emergency remote teaching, versus the planned remote teaching that if you had planned it as the format for your usual classes. What is the difference? Well, obviously it's the planning. So well-planned online learning experiences can be meaningfully different, as Hodges, Moore, Lockey, Trust and Bond have said this year, than those that are put together very quickly in an emergency as a response to a crisis or a disaster, as a lot of the remote teaching are doing now. Now, I think what you need to do if you are in a situation where you're doing emergency remote teaching, well, you need to be able to do it as best as you can to begin with. But I would recommend you all also have your eye on actually moving to a more planned delivery of remote teaching in the future. And you can do that. There's some tips I've got about where you can actually learn to, to take courses and etc. And of course, joining a webinar such as this is a step towards that as well. The other thing I'd like to say about remote teaching is that it is not delivering a webinar as I'm doing today. This is not remote teaching because there's very little interaction. There's interaction going on in the chat. And sometimes in a webinar, you do allow people to speak, but with so many people, we've got approaching, as Andre said, we could have 1,000, which is the limit on the room. Today, we're certainly approaching that. I think you can't turn on everybody's mics on because it would be complete audio chaos. However, remote teaching, what you want to achieve is what Stephen Bax, a UK academic, called in 2003 as normalization, which is when the learning technology really, as far as possible, disappears. And all it does is it allows people to come together, to teach, to learn from each other, to speak to each other, etc., etc. So I think that's an important thing to have in mind. What you want to do is you want to try and make the class as interactive as possible to actually try and do what you do in a normal face-to-face classroom as far as you can with students, although you're online. Now, of course, there are things that are different, and we'll talk about them today. So let me start by assuming that for those of you who haven't started, who have been asked to start, how you can do it. Now, with a bit of luck, you will have support from your organization or institution, school, etc., who will be able to provide a platform for you to be able to provide a room such as the one we're using now, which is Zoom, to be able to allow you to teach and allow you to support your students. That may not be the case. I have heard in some countries that that isn't the case. Maybe you could put in the chat if you are provided with the tools that you're expected to use, or if you're actually asked by your school, community, etc., to actually do this yourself. Because that's an interesting thing to know. So I have heard of schools that have just said, look, go and teach online, and they are not able to provide much of any support or tools. So I think if whatever the case, whether it's you find yourself with having to use set platforms and tools, or you have to find them yourself, I think what you need to do is really start small. So you need to start as with what you know. Don't overcomplicate things. Don't let yourself be overwhelmed with platforms and tools and resources. Now that this has happened, there are many, many tips to links and articles online about what you can do, what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, and that can be too much if you don't have a lot of experience of it. The most important thing here is that you know how to teach, and that is actually the most important thing. Using the technology is less of a challenge, believe me, it's less important. What I think you need to do is start by doing what you would do more or less in the classroom, and then adjust it as you become familiar with the tools that you're using and the students become more comfortable with this online remote teaching. Now, just as in the face-to-face class, I think what you need to do is establish a routine and make students know it. The sooner everyone becomes familiar with the online platform, the situation, what to expect, etc., the better. So make sure students know that what is expected of them and what's going to happen during the class, before the class, and after the class, and follow it up and help them with those expectations as well. On a personal level, you need to familiarize yourself with the platform as much as you can. Know how to deal with security in particular. So with Zoom, you may be concerned that you've seen some articles, etc., about some of the security flaws of Zoom. Now, most of the incidents that have happened, for example, have happened because links have been made publicly available, either by the organization, schools, or teachers, or by some of the students mischievously sharing the links to other people, hoping that there would be a disruption. That has happened. You can quickly deal with that if you are aware how to do so. So you need to, I'm not going to specifically concentrate on Zoom here because it could happen with any platform. You just need to know what the sharing permissions are. For example, how to mute and unmute students, how to control their cameras, turn them on, turn them off, how to give and deny access to tools such as the screen sharing, what I'm doing now, or to the whiteboard, etc. And most importantly, how to eject someone. And you need to keep that power, if you like, that ability as a host of the class, so that you can do that. And so if you are, it's unlikely to happen, but if you are disrupted by anybody, you can actually deal with it. So that's the first three things. There are three more things. Once you've started, I think it's important to get feedback. Get feedback from learners. What worked, what didn't work, what did they like, what did not like, what did they find useful, what did they find interesting. This is, of course, something you would do in a face-to-face class as well. But I think particularly when you're doing something new, it's important. Involve them in the experience, pay attention to them. You'll become a better teacher from it, and the students will appreciate the experience a lot more as well. I think you also need to be flexible. So don't feel you have to stick to something if it isn't working. Be prepared for a change, even a radical change, if you feel it's necessary. If something's not working, and that might be if you're starting with a platform. Well, if it's not working out, consider changing it for something better. Get advice from people. Then once you're comfortable, try new things, experiment, use the unique online aspect of this teaching to do things that you wouldn't usually do or couldn't do in the classroom. For example, in Zoom or Teams, which is another remote teaching platform, you can actually change the background, so you can have different things. You can have virtual backgrounds. Now, you can actually use that to illustrate something you're teaching, or for vocabulary, all sorts of things. So it's well worth taking in mind. I think the important thing is to be creative once you're comfortable. Then the last two tips for when you first get started are use it as an opportunity. So as I said, be creative. It's very important, I think, not to give remote teaching a negative spin, even if you feel uncomfortable about it at first. Even if you don't particularly like this way of teaching, that you really want to get back to the face-to-face classroom, that's where you feel more comfortable. I think it's very important during this time to not give that impression to the students. If that is the way you feel, consider this an opportunity for you. It's temporary. You need to create a very good atmosphere for learning, as we all know how the teacher feels and how the students feel about the experience of teaching and learning, the better it will be. And so I think you need to, even like a magician tricks himself or herself into thinking something is happening when it's not happening, and thereby tricks the audience. I think if need be, if you can't enjoy the experience, you have to trick yourself into at least finding something good about it, so that the students feel that as well, because they will feel it if you're not comfortable with teaching online. So final point here, have fun. It helps if you're enjoying yourself. Remove the distractions. So I've closed the windows, I'm alone in a room, I've closed the door. I know I'm not going to be interrupted during this hour. I'm going to have fun here. I'm going to, do what I can to make this experience useful and interesting for you. It's something I feel very passionate about, something I know a lot about, and that's what I'm hoping to put across today. So that's the beginning. What next? Well, at the British Council, we particularly feel very, we think it's a very serious thing to make sure that all children, and most of what we're doing, because this is a webinar aimed at school teachers, will be teaching young learners, so someone under the age of 18. We feel that child protection is very, very important. It's particularly important, I think, when teaching students based at home. So this new kind of remote teaching. Why? Because in the school environment, there are lots of things that you can actually manage. You can manage access, you can manage the classroom environment, you can manage lots of things. Whereas when you're teaching children at home, there might be things that are out of your control to manage. So this whole classroom management becomes particularly important. There may be an adult, a parent or a guardian in the room during the class with the student, with each of the students, which is a different kind of dynamic to your teaching. You'll probably have more contact with parents than you would normally have. What I would do is, if you can get your school and rely upon them to have the contact with the students, to manage expectations, to have a sort of code of conduct, if you like, with parents or the guardians looking after the children, so that you don't have to deal with things as they come up. You can at least refer the parents to that code of conduct. That will make things a lot better. I think it would be just things of, we need the students supervised in some way, at least so we know that they're paying attention to that extent, in which case, maybe someone can be in the room with them during the class. It doesn't have to be disturbing for that adult. The children can wear headphones, for example, and the adult can be silent, can be doing whatever the adult does, hopefully without any background noise, which will disrupt the class. That kind of thing, I think. And I think it's very important for both the students and the parents to have those expectations so that they know what is being asked for them to do. The other thing is that parents, you as teachers, the schools that you work for, and parents and students, I don't think you should feel that you should have as much time online as you would normally have if you were teaching at a school. A child comes into the school at a particular time and they leave hours later. I think you do need breaks from the online. You need to build those into a timetable. And if you can, the concentration level that is required to teach and to learn online, I think, from my experience, is a lot higher than is required when face-to-face. There seems to be more pressure and more things to think about. So I think if you can take away some things and give them to the students to do before or after the class, then that would be better. I'll say a bit more about that as we go along. Child protection. You need to be vigilant as well. You need to make sure that the children you're teaching are safe, it goes without saying. And you need to make sure that with your school and your head teachers, etc., what it is you can do if you do spot something that you're unhappy about, that you think the child is being bullied or anything else. There's a whole range of things that could be. I think there needs to be a mechanism in place, as there is in the British Council schools, for that reporting to take place and for investigations to be made if need be. So, and here's Andre, remote teaching from Colombia into Uruguay many years ago, 7 years ago, I think. So here are some of the, is that right, Andre? 7 years ago, was that? I'm sure it was. So I think there are general technology tips that you should be aware of. First off, I would hold a short 20 or 30-minute session where the main purpose is to check that all the students can hear and speak with the technology. This could be the first part of your remote class. If it is, you shouldn't expect to have too much learning going on in that session. So I think you just need to make sure that everybody can use the equipment, really. If individuals have problems, which is why it's good to do before you start the class, then contact them directly, individually, to work through the problems, sort it out, rather than disrupt the class for everyone. I think it's important for you to mute everybody on entry and encourage students to mute when they're not speaking. That prevents feedback and background noise. And as host of the remote session, you should be able to mute all if there are serious feedback problems, for example, and give access to individuals via the mic. You'll need to get to know how to do that, but it's pretty easy. It's just a question of habit, really. You could plan your warm-up and other parts of the lesson to gradually introduce features of the online platform that you want students to use, whiteboard tools, breakout rooms, for example, features of the LMS, into your lesson. So little by little, you get to help the students use some of the things that you want to use. Now, I don't have time today to talk about breakout rooms, but breakout rooms are a way of dividing an audience in a virtual space into several different virtual spaces. And then you as a teacher or host can then drop in, as you would imagine, separate classrooms or separate parts of a classroom, and monitor what the students are doing in those breakout rooms. I think if you are interested in doing that, then try it out. And there are lots of things, lots of places where you can actually get help with doing that, depending on the platform. Use the cameras as much as you can. Now, I know this is a problem with connectivity sometimes. If connectivity doesn't allow you the students to use the webcams all the lesson, then at least try to start and finish with them. It makes a difference if people can see you, if the students can see you and you can see them. It really does. I think, so try and do that. You could try and see if you turn the cameras off, but then whenever anybody starts to speak, they turn the camera on so people see them when they're speaking. So that's a way of doing it. Of course, if you can't use the cameras, then it's better to turn the cameras off than have problems with the audio. So if there are if the audio is breaking up when somebody is speaking, what you should do is suggest they turn the cameras off or turn everybody's cameras off. So at least you can all hear each other. You don't want to persist with the cameras on if the audio is breaking up. So first you need to make sure that everybody can hear each other and can speak. Then you can go ahead and teach. If you can do that with cameras, so much the better. If you need to turn the cameras off, then turn them off. Now, I would say also related to technology, you need to have a back channel open with students in case the connectivity fails. Or in case, for example, you have bad connectivity and lose connection, and the students are just either kicked out of the room or left alone in the room without a teacher. So I think if you have a way of contacting those students, either through some kind of chat in the learning management system or email, and have that in place. Look, if we lose contact with each other, we'll do X, Y, Z. Then that's important, and it will help you and save a lot of time. If you do have the LMS, the platform available, then this is probably the best place to do that. You're probably asking them to do asynchronous activities in there anyway. What you should do as well is try and flip the classroom. Now, I'm sure most of you will know what the flipped classroom is. If you don't know, it means doing some of the things online, well, doing some of the things in asking the students to do some of the things you would normally do in the classroom in their own time. In this case, imagine you probably don't want to meet students for them to start reading a textbook for 15 minutes. Or to try and do a listening together or watch a video together. That particularly might be problematic online. So why not try and rearrange your classroom, replan it, so that the students come to class having read the text at least once, having watched the video or listened to the audio. That will save time, and it also means you can maximize the kind of time that you use with them synchronously, live online, so that it makes a big difference, really. So I think that's important. You also need to have a plan B ready, which means really having an option. If you can't connect, what are you going to do? Is there something alternately, is it an alternative that they can do themselves online or offline? Is there something in the book that you can sign? It might not be as interesting, but at least it means that their time isn't wasted. So that's a plan B. There are lots of different plan Bs. You might have a general plan B up your sleeve if this happens. You might tell your students in advance, look, if you have a complete breakdown, then what I'd like you to do is this. Do it on your own. Together it should take an hour, blah, blah, blah. I think you need to keep that in mind because at some point it will happen. And if it happens during this webinar and you lose me completely, then I'm hoping that Andre will take over or something. That's my plan B. Hopefully it won't come to that. Okay, so another thing you need to do is set rules for behavior, what the expectations are at the beginning, and enforce them. I think you you know, students shouldn't be sharing links to the class to potential Zoom bombers. If it happens, you should know how to deal with it, but you should then face them. You know, what is happening? Who did this? This can't be, you know, you're wasting time. You need to sort of follow things up as you would do if there was disruption in your face-to-face classroom. In the end, this will help you and help them a lot if you don't just ignore it and try to get on with things, if you deal with it. I would also, if you can, record the session. I know a lot of teachers feel uncomfortable about recording themselves. They don't want to watch themselves back, etc. And you may well need a lot more, you need to jump through a lot more hoops to be able to do that. You might need to get permission, well, you will need to get permission forms from parents, etc., from schools, from the students, etc. But if you do have recordings of your classes, you can use them to assess and evaluate the students. You could share them with peers so that they can observe your classes and give you comments on the way you teach. And you can learn from each other that way. You can watch yourself teach, which is always a revelation. You learn so much when you watch your recording of yourself teaching, either face-to-face or online. I really recommend everybody does it. I know one of the most dramatic changes I made to my teaching face-to-face with young learners is when I recorded a complete class and watched it back with someone who gave me advice on some of the things I was doing that I could change. There was a before and after to that, so I really recommend that. You can also make the recordings available to students who missed the classes for whatever reasons. So they're available at least for them to watch. One of your plan B may be to make a recording available of a class which the students can watch and revise and try and learn something more that they missed the last time. So don't be afraid of doing that. But I do also recommend that you do need to get the relevant permissions. And if you do make recordings of your class, please respect the privacy of everybody. Don't make them publicly available, for example, on Facebook. If you do put them on a video sharing site, then password protect them, etc. And I think in your permission forms, you really need to make it state very clearly what you're going to use the recordings for. So here's some more general tips to take into account when teaching remotely. Prioritize outcomes. Everything generally takes longer to do than in a face-to-face classroom, so you probably won't be able to meet the same outcomes. So think of your priorities. What do you really want to achieve within the remote teaching session? Identify, as I said before, what can be given beforehand, what should be read and listened to before the session to save valuable time, or after. And if you're using a course book or material designed for face-to-face classes, work out what you can use without adaptation and what maybe needs to be changed or adapted or redesigned a little bit to take advantage of the online aspect of things. The other thing to do, which I'm not doing today because of various reasons, is in a class you can get up, you can stand up, you can move around, and you can ask the students to do that. One thing I saw a language teacher do in the UK in a recording was he asked students to go to the fridge and bring back a carrot, or she did rather, or go to the kitchen and find a knife. Well, knife, probably not a good thing, a spoon. Things like that, which I thought was quite interesting. She made it into a bit of a race, and I think it was one of her warmers when dealing with kitchen vocabulary, for example, food. I think that's quite a nice thing. There are lots of things you can do being in the home related to that. And it's also important if you're in a meeting with students that they're not just sitting down for the whole 40 minutes or longer sometimes. You need to plan and vary interaction patterns. So just as you would do in a face-to-face class, you can ask for answers in the chat. That way you can get quick responses from students. It's also a good way to see if students are paying attention. So if you ask people to quickly type in an answer to a question that you ask, make it a bit of a game. That will always motivate young learners to get the answer first. And the students who don't answer, you need to think, are they actually sitting watching me, especially if their cameras are turned off? Are they paying attention to me, even if their cameras are on, or their eyes glazed? Sometimes difficult to see in an online setting, but it's definitely something I think you need to think about. Also think about the tools students will need to use if they're going to write. Are they going to write on the whiteboard? When do you want to do that? Are they going to share their screens? Make sure they know how to do it, that you've introduced them how to do it. You've introduced them. Don't overload them, etc. What I said before. Be ready to do it, so you're not faffing around. I think the important thing is that students aren't left sort of like just sort of sitting being, what's happening? And the teacher's sort of clunking away, trying to open things. Have things ready. Know what to do. So there's no unnecessary delays in time. More and more so, people don't like, even young learners don't like their time being wasted. And also you lose them. You'll lose their attention if you don't do that. Use Realia and breakout rooms. I said breakout rooms before. Realia, now you can use the camera to show all sorts of things. You know, I can show my telephone. I can show a remote control. Especially at home, you might have access to lots of the things that you might not. You probably have access to lots of things you won't have access to in the classroom settings. So take advantage of that. Bring in things. Use the camera for something other than just showing yourself. And as I said before, think about virtual backgrounds that you can use if you're using a tool such as Teams or Zoom that will allow you to do that. Okay, let's look at engaging students now. Here are 8 things that I think you can really concentrate on to get full maximum engagement and motivation out of students. I'm not going to go through them in much detail, but let's look at them in turn. So the first is eye contact and screen presence. Now, how can you best establish eye contact with students when teaching remotely? Well, by looking in the camera. So if I look directly at the camera, you probably notice a difference. And then I've got a screen over here. If I'm looking at a screen where my presentation is, then you probably notice that I'm not making eye contact with you. And if you do that all the lesson, the students will be a bit unnerved because they're used to the teacher looking at them. And the good thing about online is by looking at the camera, you can look into the eyes of every single student, and that helps with classroom management and keeping them engaged. How to do that? Well, if your camera's built in to the laptop you're using, then it's easier. If you've got an external camera, as I have, I like the idea I can move it around, for example. I can use that for all sorts of different things, but I do need to make sure that it's just above where my main attention is going to be, so I'm making eye contact. Or at least I'm actually looking most of the time below the camera, but you shouldn't really notice much of a difference to if I'm looking directly in the camera, I hope. So that's that. I think your screen presence as well. I think the most important thing is not so much about what you wear, although, you know, you don't want to have students thinking, what's that he's wearing? What is it? All the time. You just really want to not have students distracted, I think is the key. But the way you position yourself on the screen should be fairly normal, you know? It shouldn't be like you're for whatever reason, sort of like this. I attend some meetings sometimes with colleagues who don't have much of an idea of screen presence, and most of the time they're sort of sitting, and they can see me fine, but I'm just seeing half of their face, and I keep thinking, can you just, you know, move a little bit? They're just not aware of how they're showing up on a screen, and I think it's important because it's distracting, and the last thing you want to do when you're teaching is to distract the students away from what you want them to learn. So there's that. Don't be just a talking head. Now, I'm just being a talking head. I said before, stand up and move, etc. If you can, use the physical space. It's a bit difficult when teaching online, but at least think about it. And when the opportunity presents itself, then you should do that. Body language. Okay. So normally, if you're walking around a classroom, you would use your hands quite a lot, I think. And the tendency for most of us when we're engaging online is not to do that much, myself included. I have to keep reminding myself that actually using gestures to emphasize points, etc., is a good thing. You need to exaggerate gestures and also face expressions online, or they'll be lost at students. you need to think that a lot of students will be looking at the class on a very small screen. So you need to exaggerate. Gesticulate, use mannerisms, use your posture, change your posture to and your stance to convey confidence or shyness or whatever you need to convey during the lesson. I think gestures in particular should be confident and clear. Students won't capture any subtle gestures. So yeah, if you do all this and vary your facial expressions, then you'll better capture your students' attention. Use of voice. Again, you need to be self-aware about how your voice is. Your voice is a valuable asset that will help you create mood, atmosphere, and transmit emotions. You may not be aware of how you speak. Sometimes when you listen to recordings, you're like, oh, that isn't me, is it? I don't like that. But actually that is probably how you're being heard by most of the people, most of the time. So they're not inside your head and can't hear what you hear inside your head. They hear what other people hear, what you hear when you listen to yourself, when you're not inside of your head. In other words, when you're on a recording. So I think you do need to think about how you come across. If you're a teacher and your voice is patronizing or loud or monotonous, then they may respond negatively. Again, it's the same face-to-face, but I think it's more important online. What you need to do is have an expressive and lively voice, and then you'll draw the attention to your students. So varying the volume, speaking softer or louder, depending on what you're doing, will help you control the class as well. Changing the tone of your voice is the best way to convey mood or emotion. How low or high the pitches of your voice is important as well. If you vary the pitch, then you'll see more interest in your students. And then also varying the pace of your voice. So how long you pause, how quickly or how slowly you speak will have a result on how students react to you. And I think variation is the key. If you can do it, and I have to keep reminding myself as well, so I think we all have a tendency to speak in a particular way. In particular, if we're not speaking face-to-face with someone in the same room, where we normally would vary ourselves. So I think it's something we all need to keep in mind. Minimize distractions. As I said before, keeping the attention of students when teaching online can be a challenge. And you can help by minimizing the opportunity for distractions. Minimizing the background, what I said, isn't too busy. So the students aren't trying to read the titles of the books that I have on my shelves here. Well, I'm lying, there aren't any shelves behind here, but you can't see them anyway, but I could have them. And also in their environment as well, you want them to have minimized the distractions so they can concentrate on the lesson as well. Use of the camera, I've already talked a little bit about that, if you can use it through Realia, etc. But you could also use the camera to zoom in. You know, with the high-end video conferencing we use in the Sabal project, we actually have a remote control that does that automatically. It pans, it zooms in, zooms out, and we can actually take control of the student's camera as well, which makes it much better than the kind of webcam that I have now, for example. But even with this webcam, you can physically move your body, so you can zoom out or you can zoom in. And if you're teaching pronunciation, you might want to bring the camera or bring your lips nearer to the camera so the students can focus on what shapes you're making or what your tongue is doing, etc. with pronunciation. You can also use a small portable whiteboard. I don't have one here, but you can get them quite easily if you want to write on them. You can use an electronic whiteboard as well, but that would vary things. Puppets, etc., all sorts of things. Particularly if you're teaching primary learners, you can bring lots of interesting things into the room. And then here's Andre again. Be familiar with the technology. Don't use a platform that you're unfamiliar with. You need to know how to adjust the settings. You need to be on top of the security, etc. before you start teaching. There's nothing worse than students hanging around, twiddling thumbs, waiting for the teacher to adjust the technology. So have what you need, what you want to use open before you start the class. It's also a good idea maybe to reboot your machine before the class, to close down unnecessary applications, things that you're not going to use during the class, because they will, if they're open, they'll take up your resources and they'll slow things down. They may be the cause of poor connectivity. So you can suggest students do the same thing. They could have lots of things open. They could have a game on in the background that they were playing before the class. That would be taking up and hogging lots of the resources on the computer. And if it's an online game, it could be sucking up that very much needed connectivity. So make sure you have that in mind. Troubleshooting. Now, I've already talked about the plan B, but sooner or later, if you're teaching remotely, you will have technical difficulties. It's going to happen because it's technology. Things fail. No matter how many precautions you make, no matter how confident you are, how well you followed some of the things I've asked you to do. So that's why you need to have the plan B. It could be anything really, and you need to be on the ball to accept that it could be a student having to check the microphone settings, or the good thing with students, if you can't actually physically go and look at their computer to see what's wrong, that might have helped. Well, get them to turn it off and turn it on again. It's a cliche, but it often can work. So it's a good thing. One of the first things they can do. And also, once you've eliminated that possibility, then you can think about what the other problems may be. I think the experience here will help, but so you'll gain experience as you go along. But I think it's very helpful for you to keep calm, appear decisive, and have those ideas. Okay, what I want you to do is turn the computer off. And a very useful tip is to have that back channel, to have an alternative platform to use. At least if you can chat with students somehow, you can do some kind of communication together. You can ask them to do things. So you might be able to save the situation. Okay, so that's most of the tips that I have for starting and for carrying on. In the more longer term, I would recommend that you do some reading, you take some courses, especially if you think this remote teaching is something you're going to be doing on a more permanent basis, and it's not just an emergency remote teaching, as I said at the beginning. And there are lots of places now where you can get lots of tips. If you can get help from evidence-based articles, etc., not necessarily academic, but certainly based on research upon people's experience, rather than a writer who's been asked to come up with 500 words on remote teaching in a week, and they've never taught remotely in their lives, which does happen, believe me, then I think that's better. One of the places that I published a chapter, and I'll talk a little bit about this chapter with a colleague of mine, a quality manager on the Sabal project, Alicia Artusi, who's from Argentina. We published in a book that the Teachers Association, IATEFL, the Learning Technology Special Interest Group, published this year, a book of research on digital innovation in language learning. And the chapter we wrote was about professional development. And what we did was we used the experience that Alicia had observing teachers and survey information from the teachers that we collected and focus groups that we conducted with a whole number of different language teachers working remotely to come up with what they thought was different from face-to-face teaching and from remote teaching, and also what they felt they needed from that. Now, there's a lot of things we talk about in the classroom, in the chapter, but I think we came up with a list of things that we thought good remote teachers are, and they were from the input from the people who are teaching remotely. I'm not going to go through all of these because some of them are actually things that we've already talked about. What you will notice, though, is a lot of this is actually very much the same as the, what a good teacher is anyway. There's only there's sort of two areas I think that are very different in remote teaching that need particular attention. One is obvious, so that's the technology, the use of technology, and some of the tips I've given you today will help you move towards doing that better. And then the other thing is remote classroom management. So classroom management at a distance is very challenging, particularly with young learners. In the Sabal project, we actually have another adult in the classroom because the students are there with the local classroom teacher. When you're teaching to students at home, that classroom management at a distance can be very difficult. And I think what you need to do is work out strategies to be able to foster a good relationship with the students, to have mutual respect going on. That's the start. Without that, then it's very, very difficult, if not impossible to do. You can look in more detail at the slides when they're posted on the link. I'm going to draw to a close now because I want to take questions, and I know we've only got 15 minutes left. So here, if you haven't posted any questions yet or comments in the Q&A box, then here's some things to think about. I would also like to draw your attention to a survey that the British Council is currently conducting with English teachers and English teacher trainers around the world who are having to cope with this crisis. And it could be through remote teaching or other ways because they may not have access to the internet. So whatever the case is, if you fill this in, this would be very useful. I think the results will be made public. There are some 8,000 plus teachers, teacher educators who have now responded to this. So it's a fairly large sample size. It's going to throw up some very interesting details. There are lots of people in the Americas, in particular Peru for some reason, who have responded to this survey. So I think that will all help if you can do that. Then the other things, before I take the Q questions, is that the British Council Teaching English site is a very good source for help. There's a special section, which is, you can see the link at the bottom right, for teachers and teacher educators coping with the impact of COVID-19. And then also there's a series of webinars about all sorts of different aspects of remote teaching. So mine has been a general, or teaching online really, mine has been a general introduction, but there are others that go into specialist subjects, which I think some of you will be very interested in. And the recordings for those are available if you can't attend them online. And then there are courses. Now, I've just heard that the British Council may be working with Future Learn to come up with a course for young learner teachers teaching online. I hope that comes off the ground. It's not certain yet, so don't quote me on it. But in the meantime, there is a general course for online teaching, which Future Learn, which is a very good platform, has available, which I think is free for anyone to join. So I recommend you join a course such as that. There are others as well. This is the one that I know about that I've joined. And then you can download a series of interviews through the Learning Technology Special Interest Group of IATEFL. This is a newsletter that normally the SIG would only make available to members, but it's available publicly to anyone who wants it through the website because of the special need in these times. It features lots of different interviews with people that you can see photos of here: Carol Rainbow, Nick Bilra, Anne Fox, Lindsay Clanfield, Gavin Dudney, and other people who have experience of remote teaching. And I think you can pick up lots of tips and advice from them. And that, it brings me almost to the end. Some of what I've been talking about was published in a British Council Voices magazine article, which you can still find online if you search on the title or click on that link. And that brings us to the end. So Andre, I'm going to hand over to you. Hopefully there have been some questions from the audience that I can answer.
Yes, Graham, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Graham. Yes, we've had some questions, so I'm trying to systematize them all, kind of bring them under general categories. And one category that comes through is the use of assessment. We had a couple of questions. from the attendees about how to use assessment with Zoom. Well, I think it's such a broad question. So have you had any experience of using Zoom for assessing students, Graham?
Not personally, but what I do know works is, and I mentioned it briefly, if you could record the session, if you're assessing students speaking, for example, then it's easier to assess students speaking than in the face-to-face classroom. If you record them, if you're able to do that, then you can review it later. Because, you know, normally if you're assessing students speaking directly, you would have to make some notes, etc., or rely upon your memory. With Zoom, you can focus upon actually the questioning and the modality, the dynamics of doing it, and then look at it. So that's definitely assessing other aspects. I think there's so much that you can do, that you could do. Not my specialist area. I do know that there was a panel discussion today on the Teaching English Facebook Live page about this very subject. So I'm imagining the recording will be available there. So I would direct people to that, because I'm sure there'll be people there with a lot more experience who have come up with lots of ideas.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I also find in my experience, it's good to not think of assessment like you have to have a standard test with everyone in Zoom room. That's not very practical and not very interactive. So if you're teaching something that requires students to produce something at the end, it's a really good way of assessing students. And many students, when I was teaching that CBAL lessons you saw photos of, they really liked presenting what they've created digitally or drawn something. So if your assessment takes this form of project assessment, bringing something and sharing with the others, maybe online, and then picking 10 top projects where you can share them live in Zoom, that's really motivating. And I was surprised how motivated children were to share their work. And it was a great honor for them to do it in front of a camera with the other kids in the classroom. So I think it can work, but you need to think of assessment as being sort of broader project assessment with something an output at the end, sort of formative assessment, right? But doing tests.
That's an excellent example which I've forgotten about. Yeah, presentations.
And another thing, if you have sort of pop quizzes and assessment throughout the term, it's good to use Zoom sessions to actually do a quiz together after the students have done it already. So that really works, and because people are not afraid asking questions, they usually can put them in chat privately. I find these sessions are really useful, where you go through the quiz together, giving feedback to the whole class, doing some of the difficult questions together, or asking other students to explain in breakout rooms to their classmates who had difficulty with certain types of questions. That really works. It makes it interactive as well.
Great idea as well.
Cheers.
You should be doing this webinar, Andre. Or you should do another one. You should do another one on assessment.
On assessment, we could, yeah, I guess. Well, let me pick out some other questions here. Slightly a more theoretical one. People were asking about remote teaching versus online teaching, saying SMS or teaching on the phone, is that remote? So what are your views on this? I mean, terminology can be important. We don't want to be splitting hairs, but I think there is a difference. How do you see remote teaching versus online versus asynchronous and synchronous? Is this all remote teaching?
No, for me, I use the term, I think this is up for debate. I'm not saying I have the definite answer, but I think it's very helpful to say online teaching when it's related to anything that is done online, so asynchronous and synchronous. So, teaching via email, teaching via chat, teaching via learning management systems, etc., WhatsApp. That's all online teaching for me. Remote teaching is when you're in the same space with someone using video. That's, for me, it's useful to have that division, because I think otherwise, nobody knows what you're talking about. So remote teaching is when you're teaching with audio and, if possible, video. Could be audio only, at the same time with students. And you have chat, but that for me is remote teaching. I don't know if you feel the same way or have a different definition.
Yeah, I think that's generally been my feeling to have those separate remote is it's more sort of an experience of you doing it together at different ends of the channel. But as some of the Matilda here mentioned in the questions, does it translate or does it work with remote learning? Well, that's a bigger debate. Does teaching translate into learning? that really depends on so many factors, and I think it doesn't always work.
No, I mean, I think for me, that's why the more you can focus some of the things, the distractions, etc., the more you can get students' attention, then the more likely your teaching is going to translate into learning.
Well, this is another set of questions and a theme of questions running through in our Q&A box. How can you make it more interactive, that it's not the sort of like we're having now, sort of talking head style? What can you do to make it more interactive?
Yeah, it's a challenge, I think. So one of the things you can do is use these backgrounds. So for example, if I stop sharing, and so all everybody can see is just us two, our videos, and the two Laura Morenos, the Laura Moreno twins who are shy, so they're not showing themselves on video. So one thing I've been experimenting with is this idea of the virtual background. Now, I'm hoping this will work because it does create, you do need to have a good bandwidth to do it, but you can do all sorts of things. So I can be behind the Northern Lights. I can be on a desert island. I could be, and you can make it a quiz. It makes it a little bit more interesting to do that. Yeah. You can put things in your background, for example, that are part of your lesson. So let me choose, for example, a room, albeit not a conventional room, but I can actually, what's this? What room is that?
Looks like a bar.
Yeah. Or others, basically you can switch between all sorts of different, I've got a very messy bedroom here. What's wrong? What should I do, Andre?
Move out.
yeah, I don't think I would want to.
Okay. No, that's a great tip. But I think what there are two things when I've been teaching online that really affect the interactivity kind of a lesson is the number of students you have. It's very difficult to do it with a group larger than 20. Well, you could use creatively breakout rooms where you put 10 and 10 people in different rooms with a specific task. But what I find really works, and it works online and offline, if you have questions that people are able to answer or think about or suggest some answers to. So what really makes our workshop interactive is this part where you ask us questions and we're thinking together about some of the problems or challenges. So I think it's the same with teaching children online. If you have a set of questions, you might send them ahead of time, ahead of your lesson, or during the lesson, or after. If you have that, it makes it interactive. It makes it genuinely naturally interactive because people then have to think to answer this question. So I think having specific questions and having a shape of the lesson. So I think that's really important. It's more to do with classroom management. So if you have a certain shape of the lesson where at the beginning you review things you studied before, then somebody has a go at presenting their work, then you introduce new material, then you have some game. If there is a shape of the lesson students are used to, it sounds a bit counterintuitive that you have a shape of the lesson, it's the same, it becomes boring, but actually no, because that shape of the lesson, some students might respond better to presentation types task. Other students might respond better to breakout rooms. People know that there will be a moment in your lesson where they will participate more actively. And that really helps to make it interactive. I know it sounds strange having a fixed structure to make it more fun and interactive, but it actually helps. It does help having this sectioned lessons where students know which parts they like and they can participate more actively in those. So that would be my couple of tips. Okay.
Great tips, Andre. I definitely think you should do the next webinar.
Well, I could do one on classroom management. Yeah. So one thing about teaching performance arts. So here we've got Corinne asking about how do you teach performance arts in Zoom?
Well, actually, there's an organization called the Hands Up Project. Have you heard of them, Andre?
No, I haven't. Hands Up Project.
Hands Up Project. So if you search on Google, you'll find them.
Yeah.
They're Nick Bilborough, who has an interview in the link that I posted before to the the Learning Technologies Special Interest Group newsletter that you can download, has an interview with Nick. He, for many years, has been running online drama through Zoom with students in Palestine. And they have plays that they use. They encourage students to write and perform their own plays.
Okay. We have some 50
interesting.
We have some 50 attendees here from Palestine, so that's good.
Yeah, Hands Up Project is a real wonderful example of the kind of innovative, creative things that you can do with Zoom. And Nick talked when I spoke to him about using green screens to make things more interesting for them as well. And they're doing it on a very kind of low-tech way. So a lot of them trying to limit the technology. It's not about the fancy technology that students can use or teachers can use. It's about what you can do with just one camera in real time. So it's like the students have to learn the play. So that also is much better for them for their English. So they perform it to a camera in one take.
Yeah. And well, one thing I've done with, I use drama sometimes in my classroom, not when things break down, just generally performances. So we just, it's in the context of EFL, you have an interesting conversation and then you ask people to go into breakout rooms and they have to act it as if they're brother and sister, or as if they're two friends that have had a row and have to make up. So you give them certain parameters, you give people the same material, but then you ask them to act things out, giving them different restrictions. Could be age restrictions, someone's sick, someone healthy, sympathetic, unsympathetic, and people go and act it out, and then they come back and they do little role play in front of the whole class. It works really well, and it's funny because the text is the same. What you're focusing on, people acting in a different way, and that really works. That's been always a hit.
That sounds great. Sounds great. So there's another webinar you can do for us on.
Maybe. So okay. Well, one more question. I think perhaps we need to wrap up soon. So many questions came in, and one is about professional development. So people are asking about how they can learn more. Some people are asking here about doing CELTA online, if there is such thing. So I think, that's a difficult one because this kind of has hit us fairly fast. Not many teachers were teaching this way. So I don't think there's any professional qualification you recommend, but people do some training.
There are, I think we're at the point where, as you said, there's a lot of ad hoc stuff coming up. That's now starting to be turned into programs of different things. Now that people are doing it, there are lots of different types of things that you can do, and people are producing webinars for specially targeted towards that, as you said, and so I think it's keeping an eye upon social media, the groups that you belong to, places like Teaching English, where things like that will be advertised as they're developed, and you can then see which ones you can choose.
Okay.
Now, that's what I would do, because I think there's
Well,
so much emerging stuff. We're actually,
yeah.
despite the the nature of this crisis and the horrific casualties and it's a horrible sickness. I know some people have had it, and it really does linger, and it's not very nice at all.
Yeah.
But
No.
despite all that, I think there's a lot of innovation going on, a lot of people doing things that otherwise they wouldn't be doing.
That's
so
true.
That's good.
So true. So what? Even just looking at our chat, there's so much, so many great ideas, so much exchange going on, and I think like human beings are great at adapting to circumstances, and I think that's our situation where we have to do things we wouldn't consider doing before. And well, I tell you, I mean, I haven't got any specialist training, done a few degrees in technology and the rest, but what I find is you have to do it. It's like any skill. You go in, get dirty, start doing it. What really helps is when you co-teach with another colleague. Yeah. And that's what we did as Plan Ceibal project. Every week we had a session at the end of the week for 30 minutes where we would debrief. And this was the greatest learning experience, because many people do things in different ways. So if you're teaching the same grade with your colleagues, and recording your lessons, that's when you kind of distance yourself a little bit from the experience of the lesson, and maybe look at it, what you did the following week. You'll be horrified, of course, but there'll be moments where you go, yeah, I could do it differently. This works better. And if you work within your group, you create a little community of practice with your colleagues, and actually look at specific lessons, how you delivered the same material remotely using the same technologies. That's when learning really happens. It takes time. You need to dedicate time to it. It's difficult, can be difficult. You don't want to be going online again to debrief, but that's when wonderful things happen, and that's when actually learning starts. It's a skill, teaching, and teaching online. It's a skill that you can only learn by doing it and thinking what works, that doesn't. But you can do it fast and better if you work with other like-minded people.
Yeah, that's some great tips you've shared there. Some really good advice there, Andre. Thank you. And just to finish, then, I think thanks to you for your time in helping with this. To Laura as well, and to everybody who participated. We had a great turnout today. So I think from the chat, people appreciate it. So thank you very much. I'm glad it's been very useful.
Yeah, we had 1,000 people attending.
Wow.
We did hit that number. So great. Thank you very much. It's great to see so many of you joining us. And we'll be running more of these events, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you again in our webinars.
Look out on the British Council Americas webpage and social media, the British Council in the Americas.
Thank you. We'll email you the presentation, the recording, the resources, certificates. You will receive them in your email. So thank you very much. And thanks, Graham. Goodbye, all.
Goodbye, everybody.
Have a great weekend.